The first time I realized I might actually hate Carl, it was during a Monday meeting when he corrected my numbers in front of the entire executive team, calmly, confidently, and with a smile that said he enjoyed it. I remember gripping my pen so hard I thought it might snap. Carl and I had been circling each other like that for almost a year. Same department, same seniority, same ambition. We were both up for the same promotion, and everyone knew it. The unspoken rule was simple. There would only be one winner, and somehow every project turned into a silent competition between us. If I spoke first, Carl would refine my point. If I led a proposal, Carl would optimize it. If I stayed quiet, Carl filled the space effortlessly. He was good, annoyingly good. Tall, always put together, dark hair that never seemed to fall out of place. The kind of guy who looked like he belonged in leadership without trying. People listened when he talked. People liked him. That alone felt unfair. So when our director announced that Carl and I would be co-leading a critical new project, something that could determine who got promoted, I felt my stomach drop. "You two balance each other," she said brightly. "Opposite styles, same drive." Carl turned toward me, extended his hand, and said, "Guess we're partners." I shook his hand, firm and quick. "Guess so." What I didn't say was, "This is a disaster." The project was intense from the start. Tight deadlines, high visibility, long hours. We were suddenly in constant contact. Emails, calls, shared documents, late meetings. At first, everything felt tense and transactional. We communicated like lawyers, precise and guarded. But friction has a way of forcing honesty. The first crack appeared late one evening around 10, when we were still in a glass-walled conference room while the rest of the floor was dark. I was staring at a spreadsheet, eyes burning, when Carl sighed. "These projections don't work," he said. I leaned back in my chair. "They do if marketing hits their targets." "They won't," he replied. "They never do." I snapped, "You don't know that." He looked at me for a long second, then said, quieter, "Victor, I'm not trying to undermine you. I'm trying to keep us from failing." Us. He hadn't said that before. Something about the way he said my name, without the edge, without the performance, made me pause. I studied his face, really looked at him. He looked tired. Not smug at all. "Fine," I said eventually. "What would you change?" He pulled his chair closer, and we started working line by line. No posturing, no competition, just two people solving a problem together. An hour passed. Then 2. At some point, he laughed, softly, surprised, at one of my dry comments. I noticed it before I could stop myself. The sound lingered in my chest longer than it should have. When we finally packed up, it was after midnight. "Drink?" Carl asked, almost casually as we stood by the elevators. I hesitated. This wasn't part of the plan. Carl wasn't part of my life outside the office. "Just one," I said. The bar across the street was nearly empty. We sat side by side instead of across from each other. A small but noticeable choice. The conversation drifted away from work. First cautiously, then more naturally. He told me about transferring from another city, about a promotion he'd lost years ago, and how it still bothered him more than he admitted. I found myself telling him things I usually kept close, how hard I'd worked to be taken seriously, how tired I was of always having to prove myself. At one point, our knees brushed under the bar. Neither of us moved. I told myself it was nothing, just exhaustion, just proximity. But when I looked at Carl, really looked at him, relaxed, open, no audience, I felt something shift. The hatred I'd been so sure of suddenly felt outdated, like it belonged to a version of the story I was no longer living. As we walked back toward the office to grab our things, he glanced at me and said, "You know you're not who I thought you were." I smiled despite myself. "You either." I didn't realize it yet, but that was the moment everything changed. After that night, something between us quietly rewired itself. At work, nothing officially changed. We were still sharp with each other in meetings, still challenged each other's ideas, but underneath it, there was a new current, something unspoken that made every interaction feel charged. We started syncing without effort. I'd draft something, and Carl would adjust it in exactly the way I'd hoped he would. He anticipated my thinking, and I hated how much I liked that. It felt intimate in a way I wasn't ready to name. The long hours didn't help. Late nights became routine. Sometimes we ordered takeout. Sometimes we worked in silence, the kind that felt comfortable instead of tense. I noticed small things, how Carl rubbed the bridge of his nose when he concentrated, how he always drank his coffee black, how his voice dropped slightly when he was tired, and I noticed how often he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. One evening, we were reviewing a presentation in his office. It was raining outside, streaks of water sliding down the windows. The building was nearly empty. Carl leaned back in his chair and said, "Can I ask you something?" I kept my eyes on my laptop. "Depends. Why did you hate me so much?" The question caught me off guard. I closed the laptop slowly and looked at him. "I didn't hate you," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "You absolutely did," I exhaled. "Fine. I thought you were arrogant, effortlessly good at everything, the kind of guy who never had to struggle." He nodded, absorbing that. "And now?" I hesitated. Honesty felt dangerous, but I'd already crossed that line with him. "Now I think you hide how much you care," I said, "and that you're harder on yourself than anyone else." He looked at me for a long moment. The rain tapped softly against the glass. "You know," he said quietly, "I thought you were cold, untouchable, like nothing ever got under your skin. And now?" A small smile tugged at his mouth. "Now I think you're just guarded." The air between us thickened. Neither of us moved. I became acutely aware of how close we were, his desk between us suddenly feeling like a flimsy barrier. I stood first, needing space. "We should finish this tomorrow." Carl didn't argue. "Yeah, tomorrow." As I reached the door, he said my name, not sharp, not casual. "Victor!" I turned. "I'm glad we're doing this project together," he said. So was I. And that realization scared me more than anything else. The following weeks blurred together. Stress mounted as the deadline approached. Upper management hovered. The promotion loomed over us like a silent judge. One night, things finally cracked. We were arguing, really arguing, for the first time in weeks. Voices low but intense. Carl thought we should compromise on a key element. I refused. "This is the wrong call," I snapped. "And tanking the whole thing isn't?" He shot back. I stepped closer, frustration buzzing under my skin. "You always want to play it safe. And you always want to prove something," he said. "To who, Victor? Them or me?" That hit harder than I expected. The room went quiet. Carl realized immediately he'd crossed a line. "I didn't mean—" "I think you did," I said. We stood there, too close again, breathing the same tense air. I could feel my pulse everywhere. In my ears. In my throat. "I don't know why this matters so much to you," I said. He swallowed. "Because you matter." The words landed between us, fragile and irreversible. For a second, neither of us moved. Then Carl took a step back, like he was afraid of himself. "We should stop," he said. "This is getting complicated." I nodded, even though every part of me resisted. "Yeah, but complication has momentum. And once it starts, it doesn't stop just because you tell it to." I went home that night knowing one thing for sure. I wasn't just competing with Carl anymore. I was falling for him. I tried to create distance after that. I really did. I stopped staying late unless absolutely necessary. I kept conversations strictly professional. Short answers. Neutral tone. If Carl noticed, he didn't call me out on it, but I could feel him watching me, measuring the change. The problem was that avoidance didn't erase what had already settled between us. Every time we were in the same room, there was a quiet tension humming under the surface. Our eyes met more often than they should have. When our hands brushed passing documents, the contact lingered just a fraction of a second too long. We were both pretending this was still just work. And we were both terrible at it. The week before the final presentation, the pressure reached a new level. Revisions piled up. Leadership requested last-minute changes. The promotion decision was coming fast, and everyone could feel it. One night, I was still at my desk close to midnight when Carl appeared, jacket off, sleeves rolled up. "You're still here," he said. "So are you," I replied without looking up. He leaned against the edge of my desk. "You've been avoiding me." I finally looked at him. "I've been focusing." He studied my face. "That's not an answer." I sighed and closed my laptop. There was no point pretending anymore. "I don't want this to get messy." Carl nodded slowly. "Neither do I." Silence stretched between us. "But," he added, "I don't think ignoring it is working." I stood, suddenly aware of how close we were again. The office lights were dimmed, the floor nearly empty. The city glowed faintly through the windows. "What do you want from me, Carl?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "Honesty." I let out a quiet laugh. "That's dangerous." "Yeah," he said softly. "I know." For a moment, I considered walking away, choosing the safe option, choosing control. Instead, I said, "I don't know how to compete with someone I care about." Carl's expression shifted, surprise first, then something warmer. "You think I don't feel the same?" That was the first time he'd admitted it. Out loud. No ambiguity. My chest tightened. "This could cost us everything." "It could," he agreed. "Or it could mean something." We stood there, suspended between risk and restraint. Carl reached out, then stopped himself, his hand hovering near my arm. "Tell me to back off," he said, "and I will." I didn't. That was all it took. He stepped closer, slow, giving me time to change my mind. When his hand finally touched my arm, it was gentle, almost cautious. The contact sent a jolt through me anyway. Our kiss wasn't dramatic. No rush, no urgency. It was quiet, careful, like we were both afraid of breaking something fragile. When we pulled apart, neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say that wouldn't complicate things further. "This stays between us," I said eventually. Carl nodded. "Of course." We didn't kiss again that night. We just stood there for a moment longer, then gathered our things and left together. Separately, technically, but walking side by side down the empty street. Over the next few days, the line we'd crossed reshaped everything. We were discreet. No stolen kisses at work. No messages that couldn't be explained away. But the connection was there, steady and undeniable. Sometimes our eyes met across a conference table, and it felt like a secret only we shared. The night before the presentation, Carl texted me. "Can't sleep." "You?" "No," I replied. "Come over," he wrote. "If you want." I stared at my phone longer than I should have. Then I grabbed my jacket. When he opened the door, he looked relieved, like he'd been holding his breath. We didn't talk much. There was no need. This time, the kiss wasn't careful. It was intense. Months of restraint and rivalry, an unspoken feeling poured into it. Hands found familiar places quickly. We learned each other in a way that felt inevitable, like this had been building long before either of us admitted it. Afterward, lying next to him in the quiet, Carl turned to me and said, "No matter what happens tomorrow, I don't regret this." Neither did I. But as I stared at the ceiling, the reality crept in. Tomorrow, only one of us would win, and whatever happened next would change everything. The presentation morning felt unreal. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting my tie, replaying the night before in fragments. Carl's quiet laugh, the way he'd looked at me like there was nowhere else he wanted to be. For a few hours, the world had narrowed down to just the two of us. Now reality was back, sharp and demanding. At the office, everything was crisp and polished. The conference room filled with executives, coffee cups, low murmurs. Carl and I didn't acknowledge each other beyond a professional nod. If anyone noticed the tension, they probably assumed it was nerves. We presented flawlessly. That was the worst part. We moved like a single mind, finishing each other's points, transitioning seamlessly, anticipating questions before they were asked. I caught Carl's eye once during a particularly tough exchange with the CFO, and the look we shared was pure alignment. Trust. When it was over, The room buzzed with approval. "Excellent work," our director said. "Both of you." Both. The decision wouldn't come immediately. They needed time, they said. A few days, maybe a week. The waiting was torture. Carl and I fell into a strange limbo. We didn't see each other outside of work again. Not out of distance, but out of caution. Too much was at stake. Instead, we exchanged quiet looks, brief smiles when no one was watching. Sometimes a message late at night. Nothing explicit, just enough to remind each other we were still there. "You holding up?" "Barely." "Same." 3 days later, HR called me in. I already knew before they said it. Something in the way they smiled, the careful neutrality. "We're offering you the promotion," they told me. "Your leadership on the project stood out." I thanked them. I shook hands. I walked back to my desk feeling oddly hollow. Carl found me an hour later. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "Thanks," I replied. We stood there, surrounded by the hum of the office, neither of us sure what came next. This was the moment we'd both been racing toward, the finish line. "I meant what I said," Carl added. "I don't regret us." "I know," I said. "I don't either." There was relief in his eyes, and sadness, but no bitterness. That was Carl. Always honest, even when it hurt. That evening, I packed up my desk a little later than usual. As I stepped into the elevator, Carl was already there. The doors closed. For a moment, we were just two men standing side by side, the city descending beneath us. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "what happens now?" I thought about that, about the rivalry that had defined us, the connection that had surprised us, the way everything had shifted without either of us planning it. "I don't want to lose you," I said simply. He nodded. "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." When the elevator reached the lobby, we walked out together. This time, there was no competition left between us, just something new, uncertain, and real, waiting to be figured out. The weeks after, the promotion felt quieter, but heavier. My new role came with a different office, different meetings, different expectations. Carl and I no longer sat near each other. Our paths crossed less often, and when they did, it was brief and deliberate. Professional, careful, too careful. At first, I told myself this was just the adjustment period, that once things settled, we'd figure out how to exist in this new version of reality. But distance has a way of exaggerating doubts. One night, after a long day of onboarding meetings, I found myself staring at my phone again. Carl hadn't texted in days, not because he didn't care, I knew better than that, but because we were both trying to be responsible. Adult. Sensible. I hated how lonely that felt, so I did the thing I'd been avoiding. I went to his place. He opened the door looking surprised, and then unmistakably relieved. He stepped aside without a word, letting me in. "Hi," he said. "Hi." For a moment, we just stood there, the weight of everything pressing down on us again. Then Carl let out a breath and leaned against the wall. "This is harder than I thought," he admitted. I nodded. "Me too." We sat on his couch, closer than necessary but not touching. The city hummed outside. Life went on, indifferent to our confusion. "I don't want to be a secret forever," Carl said finally. "But I also don't want to put you in a position where people question your promotion." I turned toward him. "I didn't get this because of you." "I know," he said quickly, "but optics don't care about truth." He was right, and that was the problem. "What are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying," he replied slowly, "that I care about you enough to be patient. But I need to know this isn't just something that happened under pressure." I met his gaze. There was no challenge there, just honesty. "This isn't temporary," I said, "and it's not convenient. If it were, I would have walked away already." That earned a small smile. Carl reached for my hand then, lacing his fingers with mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. The contact grounded me. "Okay," he said, "then we take it slow. Out of the office. On our terms." I squeezed his hand. "Deal." From that point on, we rebuilt things differently. No rush nights before deadlines, no secrecy fueled by stress. Just dinners, long walks, quiet conversations, where rivalry had no place. We learned who we were without the pressure pushing us together. And the more time passed, the clearer it became. Whatever we'd started as, we were no longer enemies. Not even competitors. We were choosing each other. I didn't know what the future held. There were still risks, still questions. But for the first time in a long while, ambition wasn't the loudest thing in my life. Something steadier had taken its place. And it felt like home. Taking it slow turned out to be harder than either of us expected, not because the feelings faded, but because they deepened. Without the constant urgency of work tying us together, Carl and I had space. Real space. And in that space, we started seeing each other more clearly. We kept things deliberately separate from the office. No lunch meetings that looked suspicious. No late nights that invited questions. Instead, we met in parts of the city where no one knew us. Small restaurants, quiet bars, long evening walks where the conversation wandered without an agenda. Carl was different outside of work. Softer, less controlled. He talked with his hands more, laughed more easily. He told me stories about his childhood, about a father who valued achievement above everything else, and how losing still felt like failure to him, even now. One night, sitting on his balcony with a beer between us, he said, "I don't think I've ever let myself come second before." I looked at him. "You didn't come second." He smiled faintly. "Didn't I?" I understood what he meant. This wasn't about the promotion anymore. It was about identity. About who he was when he wasn't winning. "You chose something else," I said. "That's not losing." He considered that for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm still getting used to that idea." At work, the dynamic shifted again, but this time in a way I hadn't expected. Carl started speaking up more independently. He took ownership of projects that had nothing to do with me. People noticed. Leadership noticed. The version of him that had once been my rival was evolving into something sharper, more confident, not competitive with me, but aligned with himself. Watching that filled me with a quiet pride I hadn't anticipated. A few months later, our director called Carl into her office. When he told me afterward that he'd been offered a role on a new strategic team, one that would put him on a different trajectory entirely, I saw the old excitement spark in his eyes. "I think I want to take it," he said. I didn't hesitate. "You should." "You're not worried?" he asked. I shook my head. "I'm not competing with you anymore, remember?" He laughed, then leaned in and kissed me, quick, instinctive, right there in the hallway outside his apartment. It was risky, it was careless, it was us. That night, lying together, Carl traced slow patterns on my chest and said, "Funny how I thought you were my biggest obstacle." "And now?" I asked. "Now you're the reason I don't feel like I have to prove anything." I closed my eyes, letting that settle. We hadn't planned this. We hadn't engineered it. What started as resentment had stripped itself down to honesty. Then trust. Then something that felt steady enough to build on. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man I'd once measured myself against had become the one person I didn't feel the need to compete with at all. And that felt like winning. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges. A year passed, quietly, steadily, and the urgency that once defined everything between Carl and me faded into something calmer. We fell into a rhythm that didn't need constant negotiation. Work stayed at work. What we had lived in the spaces around it. Carl's new role pushed him in ways I recognized immediately. New pressure. New expectations. But this time, he didn't carry it alone. He talked to me. Really talked. About doubts. About excitement. About the strange relief of not being measured against me anymore. One evening, after a long week for both of us, we sat on my couch eating takeout straight from the containers. No candles, no plans. "I used to think tension meant passion," Carl said absent-mindedly. Like if it wasn't hard, it didn't matter. And now? I asked. Now I think stability is underrated. I smiled. That might be the most uncompetitive thing you've ever said. He laughed and leaned his head against my shoulder. It felt natural in a way that still surprised me. Not everything was perfect. We still disagreed. Sometimes work spilled over. Sometimes ambition flared up in old ways. But the difference was this. We weren't fighting for position anymore. We were choosing alignment. One night, after a company event, we walked home together through quiet streets. The city felt distant, muted. "Do you ever think about how this started?" Carl asked. "All the time." I admitted. "I thought you were the problem I had to beat. And I thought you were the wall I couldn't get past," he said. We stopped at a crosswalk, the light glowing red between us. "Funny," he added, "how wrong we both were." I reached for his hand without thinking. He squeezed it back. The light changed. We crossed together. Later, lying in bed, Carl turned toward me and said, "If we hadn't been rivals, do you think we still would have found each other?" I thought about that for a long moment. "I think," I said slowly, "we needed the friction to pay attention." He smiled. "Figures. I didn't know where we'd be 5 years from now. Careers change, people evolve. But I knew this. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be about winning. It would be about choosing, again and again, not to turn away. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough."